On the morning of May 8, 1945, as church bells rang across Europe, many German field marshals were already in Allied custody, while others had surrendered earlier or were held far from Germany. Some sat in guarded rooms, some waited for interrogation, and a few had already fallen before the war ended. Imagine that for a moment. The medals that once shined on their uniforms no longer carried any power, and many of the men now sat under guard, stripped of authority and waiting for the decisions of the victors. The voices that once roared across battlefields were reduced to tired breaths. The fall of these men did not come in the same way. Some surrendered quietly, but others faced trials, long interrogations, or harsh judgments that echoed far beyond the war's end. After Germany's surrender, the surviving field marshals followed very different paths. Some faced trials, some went into prison camps, and a few were never seen again on the world stage, a path no one could have predicted when they stood at the height of their power. And that difference raises a quiet question beneath everything. What truly awaited these men? Justice, punishment, or something far more complicated? The story ahead follows how these once powerful men faced judgment after losing the authority they had held during the war, from command to consequence. A journey filled with turns, ironies, and truths that history reveals only to those patient enough to follow them. To understand what became of these field marshals, we must first understand who they were and what they represented. In December 1941, at the height of German power, a field marshal might have stood before a map of Europe that winter, seeing German flags stretching from the frozen shores of Norway to the scorching sands of North Africa, from the Atlantic coast to the very gates of Moscow. These were not ordinary soldiers. They held the highest military rank in the German armed forces, a position of such prestige that only a select few ever achieved it. Hitler himself trusted them to execute his vision of conquest, to transform his strategic ambitions into battlefield realities. They had commanded the Blitzkrieg campaigns that stunned the world, Poland falling in mere weeks in September 1939, France crumbling in 6 weeks during the spring of 1940, the Low Countries overrun in days. They had planned Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union launched in June 1941, with over 3 million German soldiers pouring across the border. Their decisions affected the lives of millions. Their orders carried the weight of life and death for entire populations. Perhaps one of these field marshals, sitting in his headquarters during those glory days, might have reflected on how far he had come, how the traditions of Prussian military excellence had brought him to this pinnacle of power. But by 1945, that power had crumbled into dust and ashes. The maps that once showed triumphant advances now documented retreat and collapse. The armies they had commanded were destroyed or captured, and the justice they would face, or avoid, would be as inconsistent as it was incomplete. 6 field marshals, 6 different fates. The first to face his reckoning would never make it to the courtroom at all. The field marshal's hands might have trembled on that November morning in 1941 as he studied the maps showing German forces stalled before Moscow. Walter von Brauchitsch, commander-in-chief of the German army since 1938, had reached the height of his military career, yet he felt it slipping away. Those near him may have noticed his pale face, short breath, and the weaker voice that once carried confidence during the fast victories in Poland and France. He supervised and approved the Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939 to 1940, which were mainly planned by senior staff officers such as Franz Halder and Erich von Manstein, and he helped guide their work. But Hitler's growing interference slowly destroyed the trust between them, as every suggestion was questioned and every decision was taken from his hands. The breaking point came in November 1941. We can imagine the room, maps showing Soviet counterattacks pushing back exhausted troops, reports of frozen equipment and frost-bitten soldiers, and then the sudden pain in Brauchitsch's chest. The heart attack forced him to step away from command. Operation Typhoon, meant to take Moscow, was failing, and his health fell with it. In December, Hitler dismissed him. Perhaps there was a moment of relief when the impossible weight lifted, but any relief could not last long. After he was removed from command, he spent most of his time in forced retirement at his estate, although he was sometimes called in for consultation or received medical treatment. The man who once directed Germany's greatest victories would never hear his accusers, and justice, if that is what his trial might have brought, never reached him. History must judge Walter von Brauchitsch through the documents and the memories left behind. The courtroom in Nuremberg was quieter during the High Command trial. Fewer reporters came, and less international attention followed the hearings. But the weight of evidence was still heavy. Here, military commanders faced judgment for their roles in Germany's campaigns of conquest and occupation. Among them sat two Field Marshals, whose careers had moved along similar paths, but whose sentences would be dramatically different: Georg von Küchler and Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb. Both were artillery officers who had commanded major operations on the Eastern Front, and both were later accused of allowing or passing on orders that went beyond legitimate warfare and led to war crimes. Yet one would serve less than a decade, while the other would walk free with almost no punishment at all. Their stories reveal how inconsistent post-war justice could be, and how politics sometimes shaped decisions that should have been purely legal. Georg von Küchler represented the old Prussian military tradition, methodical, disciplined, and committed to service. He joined the German army in 1900, fought through World War I, and continued into the Weimar years and Hitler's rearmament. When World War II began, he had decades of experience behind him. During the war, he commanded the 18th Army and later Army Group North, playing a major role in Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. In 1942, Hitler promoted him to Field Marshal. He likely believed that he was simply a soldier doing his duty, following the traditions he had learned since his cadet days. But the operations carried out under his command went far beyond conventional warfare. His forces enforced harsh occupation policies that caused widespread suffering. Under his command, occupation policies in the Soviet Union were extremely harsh. Civilians faced reprisals, villages were destroyed, and Soviet prisoners of war in his area suffered terribly from hunger, cold, and disease. Later, prosecutors argued that these conditions were not just the result of the front line, but the outcome of policies that treated whole groups of people as less than human. When prosecutors presented this evidence, Küchler maintained a controlled expression, though some later claimed his jaw tightened when photographs of emaciated prisoners were shown, or when documents bearing his signature appeared. His defense tried to shift blame. Yes, he admitted, conditions had been harsh, but he tried to blame the Russian winter, speaking as if the weather itself, not policy, explained the lack of food, shelter, and medical care, as if the weather, not policy, explained the lack of food, shelter, and medical care. He argued that army officials exaggerated death rates to secure more supplies. These claims did not convince the judges. Küchler was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. His original 20-year sentence was reduced to 12 in 1951, and he was released from prison in 1953, after serving less than a decade. But could 8 years in prison ever balance the lives lost? The prisoners who starved, the civilians executed in reprisals, the disabled murdered because they did not fit Nazi ideology's vision of human worth? While Küchler embodied Prussian efficiency, Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb represented Bavarian military nobility. His Ritter title came from the military order of Max Joseph during World War I, a decoration that turned Leeb into Ritter von Leeb. Yet the honor contrasted sharply with the suffering later connected to Army Group North, which he commanded during the invasion of the Soviet Union. Leeb's early World War II career was built on triumph. He led Army Group C during the invasion of France in 1940, earning promotion to Field Marshal. In those months, when Germany seemed unstoppable, Lieb might have believed he was helping shape a new European order under German control, but the real test came on March 30th, 1941, when Lieb sat among hundreds of senior officers as Adolf Hitler described the coming war against the Soviet Union, not as a normal campaign, but as a racial and ideological struggle. Hitler announced that cities would be starved, political commissars executed, and entire groups targeted. Some officers may have been troubled, yet no record shows Lieb objecting. He did not protest or resign. Instead, he soon transmitted the same orders that turned Hitler's plans into reality. As commander of Army Group North during Operation Barbarossa, Lieb advanced toward Leningrad, while his rear areas witnessed atrocities. He passed down the Barbarossa Decree, authorizing the killing of commissars and harsh treatment of prisoners. His forces cooperated with SS Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units responsible for mass executions, especially of Jewish civilians. Documents from Army Group North headquarters show that criminal orders and reports passed through Lieb's command structure. While they did not always carry his personal signature, they moved under his authority and with the knowledge of his staff. Reports came back describing severe measures against civilians and partisans. Perhaps Lieb convinced himself that these were military necessities or that SS operations were separate, but his army provided support for actions that had nothing to do with legitimate warfare. By early 1942, the advance had stalled, and the siege of Leningrad dragged on. On January 15th, Lieb asked Hitler either for full autonomy or to be relieved. Hitler dismissed him and replaced him with Georg von Küchler. Lieb never held command again, which may have limited his further involvement in the brutal years that followed. At Nuremberg, Lieb's defense tried to build an image of a professional soldier who neither saw nor intended criminal actions. His lawyer argued that battlefield pressures, not deliberate orders, caused any harsh measures, and emphasized the lack of documents containing Lieb's personal signature. The court convicted him of transmitting the Barbarossa Decree and held him responsible for its consequences, yet the sentence shocked observers. 3 years, counted as time already served, meaning he walked free immediately. The judgment argued that no criminal order with his signature had been introduced into evidence, a narrow legal view that ignored broader command responsibility. How could a commander whose forces cooperated with SS death squads face no real punishment? The answer exposes limits of post-war justice. The challenge of proving direct responsibility when commanders avoided signing incriminating documents, the Cold War environment that discouraged harsh punishment of officers who fought the Soviets, or the uneven nature of judicial interpretation. Later research showed that Lieb had received large secret gifts from Hitler, hundreds of thousands of Reichsmarks in cash, and an estate worth many hundreds of thousands more. These rewards suggested closer cooperation with the Nazi regime than he admitted at his trial, rewards that showed deeper cooperation with the Nazi regime than he admitted. Yet he still walked free. Lieb retired to his Bavarian estate in Hohenschwangau and lived quietly until his death in 1956. Did he feel vindicated? Or did he understand how narrowly he had escaped responsibility for actions carried out under his command? The contrast between Küchler and Lieb raises troubling questions. Both were field marshals. Both fought on the Eastern Front. Both allowed criminal orders to move through their commands, even if they later tried to distance themselves from the results. Yet Küchler received 20 years, later reduced to 12, serving 8 while Lieb served none. Better lawyers, more sympathetic judges, or stronger evidence against Küchler may explain the gap, or perhaps it reflected the inconsistent justice of a world recovering from total war. For those who suffered, the prisoners who starved, the civilians executed in reprisals, the mentally ill murdered because Nazi ideology declared them unworthy, the light sentences must have seemed like justice denied. Their suffering was real and traceable to decisions made at the highest levels, yet the men who issued those decisions faced only a few years. or no punishment at all. In May 1940, as his panzer columns pushed through the Ardennes forest, Paul Ludwig von Kleist might have felt the rush that comes with perfect victory. Leading the Panzer Group Kleist, he helped deliver the kind of rapid breakthrough that made Blitzkrieg famous: speed, surprise, and crushing power. Military historians would later study these operations for decades. A junior officer serving under him might have heard him say, "This is how modern war is fought, not in trenches but in movement." Yet in the enormous spaces of the Soviet Union, Kleist would learn that movement alone could not win a war. When Operation Barbarossa began in June 1941, he commanded the 1st Panzer Group, which later became the 1st Panzer Army, and took part in some of the largest encirclements in military history. At Kiev, more than 600,000 Soviet soldiers were trapped. Inside his headquarters, maps probably showed the pocket closing, staff officers celebrating what looked like flawless victories. But even then, signs of future disaster were visible. The distances were too great, the winter too harsh, and the supply lines too weak. A surviving staff officer might later recall Kleist staring at a map in late 1941 and whispering, "It's too big. How can we hold this?" In 1942, Kleist took command of Army Group A and was ordered to seize the Caucasus oil fields, fuel that Germany desperately needed. But the campaign stalled. German forces advanced too far, supply lines snapped, and Soviet resistance hardened. By early 1943, his troops were in retreat. The maps that once showed bold arrows of advance now displayed Soviet counterattacks pushing them back. On March 30th, 1944, Hitler dismissed him and replaced him with Ferdinand Schörner, a man known for blind loyalty. Kleist's military career was over, but his troubles were just beginning. After the failed July 20th, 1944 assassination attempt on Hitler, the Gestapo launched a sweeping investigation. Kleist's cousin had been involved in the earlier Oster conspiracy, and that single connection placed him in danger. We can imagine him sitting in an interrogation room, stripped of rank and questioned by hard-faced investigators. The irony would have been sharp. He had served Hitler for years, commanded armies that brought destruction across Eastern Europe, yet now he was suspected of disloyalty rather than accused of war crimes. He eventually escaped prosecution due to lack of evidence and lived to see Germany fall in 1945. But his fate diverged sharply from that of many other field marshals. After Germany's surrender, he was captured by American forces and later held by the British, testifying at Nuremberg. In 1946, he was extradited to Yugoslavia, where he was sentenced to 15 years for war crimes. In 1949, he was handed over to the Soviet Union and received a 25-year sentence in a labor camp. From Allied hands to Yugoslav prison to Soviet labor camp, Kleist's post-war journey became a path through the geography of German crimes. While Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb walked free after serving his term, and while Georg von Küchler, after serving only part of a war crimes sentence, was released and spent his last years in Bavaria, Kleist remained behind bars. In his cell, perhaps, he reflected on the arc of his life, from victory in France to defeat in Russia to captivity far from home. A fellow prisoner might later claim that Kleist once said, "I was a soldier. I followed orders." But in a Soviet camp, among guards whose families had suffered under German occupation, such words carried little weight. On November 13, 1954, in Vladimir Central Prison, Paul Ludwig von Kleist finally failed. Paul Ludwig von Kleist finally failed. He was 73. He had survived the Eastern Front, the Gestapo, Yugoslav courts, and years of Soviet imprisonment. But in the end, he died alone in a cell. He became one of the highest-ranking German officers to die in Soviet custody. A stark reminder of the difference between Western leniency and Soviet judgment. For the Soviets, the crimes committed on their soil demanded real punishment, and Kleist paid that price until his last breath. 2 field marshals, 2 sets of crimes in the brutal Balkans campaigns, 2 paths that led to escape from full accountability. The stories of Maximilian von Weichs and Wilhelm List reveal perhaps the greatest failure of post-war justice, not the light sentences imposed on some commanders, but the fact that some avoided meaningful punishment entirely. The Balkans campaigns from 1941 to 1944 combined conventional military operations with savage counterinsurgency warfare. German forces faced determined partisan resistance in Yugoslavia and Greece, and their response was to implement brutal anti-partisan policies that resulted in mass executions of civilians, the burning of entire villages, and reprisal operations that killed hundreds for each German soldier lost to partisan attack. The line between military operation and war crime had long since been crossed, and both Weichs and List commanded forces that participated in these atrocities. Perhaps both men told themselves that partisan warfare required harsh measures. Perhaps they convinced themselves that the reprisal policies, shooting 50 or 100 civilians for each German soldier killed, were necessary to maintain control of occupied territory. Perhaps they believed that the mass executions and village burnings were regrettable but unavoidable aspects of counterinsurgency. But the evidence gathered for the Nuremberg hostages trial and presented in court against men like List showed that what happened in the Balkans went far beyond military necessity and into deliberate terror and collective punishment of civilians. Maximilian von Weichs had commanded the Second Army during major campaigns, including the invasions of France, Yugoslavia, and the Soviet Union. His military career placed him at the center of Germany's aggressive wars, but it was his long command over German forces in the Balkans from 1942 to 1945 that later connected him most directly to the war crimes charges. Taking command in the Balkans in 1944 meant inheriting a brutal counterinsurgency war. Weichs might have received reports daily. Partisans ambushed a supply convoy, a village was suspected of harboring resistance fighters, and an officer was killed by a sniper. His orders, or those issued by his subordinates acting on his authority, regularly called for harsh reprisals. The documented policies specified execution quotas. For every German soldier killed, dozens or even hundreds of civilians would be shot. Villages would be burned, hostages would be hanged in public squares as warnings to others. When the war ended, American troops arrested Weichs in May 1945. He was charged and scheduled to appear in the hostages trial at Nuremberg, where German generals would face prosecution for war crimes related to the suppression of partisans in the Balkans. The evidence against him seemed substantial. Files documented reprisal operations, orders bearing his headquarters stamps, testimony from survivors describing the systematic terror imposed on civilian populations. But Maximilian von Weichs never faced judgment. Before trial proceedings could conclude, he was removed from the case. The official reason given was medical reasons, a justification that immediately raised ethical questions among prosecutors and observers. He was removed from the proceedings for medical reasons, which meant he was not tried, even though the charges against him were not dismissed. Was Weichs genuinely ill? Perhaps he was. At 72 years of age by the time of his death in 1954, he might well have suffered from serious health conditions. Or perhaps, as some suspected, age and connections provided an escape route that younger or less well-connected officers could not access. A Yugoslav representative at Nuremberg might have stood up in protest when the decision was announced and said something like, "The victims of his orders didn't receive medical exemptions from death. Why should he receive one from justice?" The decision to remove Weichs from the trial exemplified the inconsistency of post-war justice. Some men faced harsh sentences, while others escaped prosecution on grounds that seemed more convenient than convincing. Weichs lived another 9 years after avoiding trial, dying in Bonn, West Germany, on September 27, 1954. 9 comfortable years in freedom, while the memories of burned villages and executed civilians remained fresh in the Balkans, while survivors carried their trauma, while justice remained incomplete. Wilhelm List's career followed a path similar to many career officers. After World War I, he remained in the reduced Reichswehr, helping to modernize Germany's military under the limitations imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. When World War II began, he played a key role in the invasion of Poland in September 1939, and his success earned him Hitler's favor and promotion to Field Marshal in 1940. List's most notable wartime assignment came in 1941, when he commanded Army Group A during the Balkan Campaign, leading German forces in the invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece. Like Weichs, List's command in the Balkans connected him directly to the brutal repression carried out there. The region saw mass executions, harsh reprisals against partisans and civilians, and systematic terror designed to suppress resistance. While historians have debated the extent of List's personal involvement in specific atrocities, his position as commanding officer made him responsible under the doctrine of "this principle of command responsibility, strengthened at the Nuremberg trials, held commanders liable when they knew or should have known about crimes committed by their troops, that held commanders accountable for crimes committed by their subordinates when the commander knew or should have known about the crimes and failed to prevent or punish them." In 1942, List's career ended abruptly during Case Blue, the German summer offensive on the Eastern Front. He was tasked with leading forces to capture the vital oil fields in the Caucasus, but his troops faced severe logistical challenges and strong Soviet resistance. When the operation faltered and failed to achieve its objectives, Hitler dismissed List from command. Perhaps the dismissal saved him from deeper involvement in the Eastern Front atrocities that would continue through 1943 and 1944, or perhaps it simply gave him distance from failures that might have led to earlier disgrace. After the war, Allied forces arrested List and brought him to trial in the hostages trial, where evidence was presented about reprisal operations in the Balkans, orders to execute civilians, documents from his headquarters authorizing severe measures against partisan activity, testimony from Greek and Yugoslav witnesses who survived massacres. We can imagine List sitting through this testimony. Greek villagers describing how German soldiers rounded up all the men in their community and shot them, Yugoslav witnesses detailing mass hangings in town squares, documents with his headquarters' official stamps approving operations that treated entire populations as potential enemies. The court found Wilhelm List guilty of war crimes and sentenced him to life imprisonment in 1948. Life imprisonment seemed appropriate for the scale of crimes committed under his command, appropriate for the civilians executed, the villages destroyed, the systematic terror imposed on occupied populations. But List did not serve life in prison. Not even close. In 1953, just 5 years after his conviction, he was released in late 1952 on grounds of ill health. Yet List lived for 19 more years after his release, finally dying on August 17, 1971, at the age of 91. Released for ill health in 1953, he survived nearly 2 more decades, living comfortably in Germany while the memory of his crimes slowly faded. The irony of his long life after such a brief imprisonment stands in stark contrast to the finality of death experienced by the thousands who died under his command in the Balkans. A survivor from a Greek village destroyed in a reprisal operation, learning decades later of List's comfortable old age in Germany, might have wondered bitterly, where was justice? Where was accountability? We suffered, our families were destroyed, and he lived to 91 after serving 5 years. The cases of Maximilian von Weichs and Wilhelm List highlight the most troubling aspect of post-war justice. Not just that some sentences were too light, but that some men escaped meaningful punishment entirely. Both commanded forces in the Balkans, both bore responsibility for brutal anti-partisan operations, both were charged with serious war crimes. Yet Weichs never faced judgment at all, removed from prosecution on medical grounds. List received life imprisonment, but served only 5 years before release, then lived nearly 2 more decades in freedom. What explains this leniency? Age and health became convenient escape routes from accountability. Medical reasons were accepted without much scrutiny or skepticism. The exhaustion of post-war prosecutorial efforts, the emerging Cold War that made the West reluctant to punish former anti-Soviet commanders too harshly, and perhaps simple compassion for elderly men all combined to undermine the principles of justice. A prosecutor who worked on the hostages trial might have later reflected, either in writing or in private thoughts, "We secured convictions. We established that command responsibility meant something. But the sentences meant little when political pressure, Cold War calculations, and sympathy for old men led to early releases or removal from prosecution." The victims in the Balkans, looking to Nuremberg for justice, must have felt betrayed. For those who suffered, the families of executed villagers, the survivors of reprisal operations, the witnesses who testified in the hope that justice would be served, the light treatment of Weichs and List represented not just leniency, but a fundamental failure to acknowledge the full weight of their suffering. 6 field marshals, 6 different paths through the ruins of the Third Reich into the uncertain world of post-war justice. Walter von Brauchitsch died of pneumonia before facing trial, taking whatever testimony he might have given to his grave. Georg von Küchler was given a 20-year sentence that was later reduced to 12 years, but he spent only about 8 years in custody in total before he was released and returned to Bavaria. Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb received 3 years, time served, and walked free despite transmitting criminal orders that led to mass death. Paul Ludwig von Kleist died in Soviet custody after spending almost 10 years in different prisons under the Allies, Yugoslavia, and the Soviet Union, although he spent only about 5 of those years in the Soviet labor camp system. Maximilian von Weichs escaped prosecution entirely on medical grounds. Wilhelm List served almost 5 years of a life sentence before he was released for health reasons, then lived 19 more years. The only pattern visible across these 6 stories is inconsistency. Some factors seemed to matter. Western Allied prosecutors were often more lenient than Soviet authorities. Age and health could provide escape routes from accountability. The specific evidence available varied from case to case, and the emerging Cold War context made the West reluctant to harshly punish commanders who had fought against the Soviet Union. Perhaps a future historian, examining these cases decades or centuries later, would struggle to identify the principles that guided post-war justice. What determined who faced harsh punishment and who escaped with minimal consequences? Military necessity as a defense? Age and health as mitigating factors? The quality of legal representation? The sympathies of particular judges? Political calculations about the Cold War? All of these factors seemed to play roles, but none provided consistent guidance. Compare these field marshals' fates to those of lower-ranking soldiers and officers. While men who commanded armies received lenient treatment or escaped prosecution, thousands of ordinary soldiers faced harsh penalties for following orders these same field marshals had issued. The paradox is striking. Command responsibility should have meant greater accountability for those at the top, not less. These were not mere cogs in the military machine. They were the operators of that machine, the ones who chose how to turn its gears, the ones who decided how brutally or humanely to conduct campaigns. A defense attorney at Nuremberg might have argued that the field marshals were products of their time, trained in military traditions that emphasized obedience and duty, operating within a system where Hitler's orders carried the weight of law. But prosecutors would counter, these were not junior officers following orders blindly. They were field marshals who gave orders to hundreds of thousands of subordinates, who planned and directed campaigns, who made choices about how operations would be conducted. The philosophical question remained unresolved at Nuremberg and remains debated today. Can a military commander claim, "I was just following orders," when he himself gave the orders that resulted in atrocities? At what point does the doctrine of military obedience cease to excuse criminal conduct? When does command responsibility become personal culpability? The Western Allies' approach to these questions was notably more forgiving than that of the Soviet Union. Western courts often accepted explanations about military necessity, reduced sentences, and released prisoners early. Soviet courts showed no such leniency, as Paul Ludwig von Kleist discovered. He died in prison after serving nearly a decade of his 25-year sentence. Real punishment for real crimes committed on the Eastern Front, where the Soviet Union had suffered most grievously. This contrast reveals a troubling aspect of post-war justice. Its inconsistency was not just about individual cases, but about fundamental differences in how various Allied powers approached accountability. The Soviets, who had lost over 20 million people in the war, saw no reason for mercy toward German commanders. The Western Allies increasingly focused on the Cold War confrontation with the Soviet Union, sometimes seemed more interested in recruiting former German officers as experts on fighting the Red Army than in punishing them for past crimes. Behind every field marshal's story lie millions of individual tragedies: the soldiers who died following their orders, the prisoners of war who starved in camps under their jurisdiction, the civilians shot in reprisal operations authorized by their headquarters, the mental patients murdered because Nazi ideology deemed them unworthy of life. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. Millions killed on the Eastern Front, hundreds of thousands of Soviet prisoners dead in German camps, tens of thousands of civilians executed in anti-partisan operations in the Balkans and elsewhere. A Soviet veteran, learning that Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb only served time, or that Maximilian von Weichs was included as a defendant in the hostages trial, but he was removed from the proceedings for medical reasons, so he never received a final judgment. "We suffered under their orders," this veteran might have said. "We lost families, futures, everything we had. And they lived out their days in comfort, or faced only a few years of imprisonment. What does justice mean if this is the result?" The answer, uncomfortable as it may be, is that post-war justice for Germany's field marshals was partial, inconsistent, and often inadequate. Some accountability was achieved, trials happened, convictions were secured, the principle was established that military commanders could be held responsible for war crimes. This represented real progress in international law, establishing precedents that continue to matter today. But the gaps were enormous. Men who transmitted criminal orders served minimal prison time or escaped prosecution entirely. Political calculations and Cold War considerations influenced what should have been purely legal proceedings. The inconsistency between cases undermined the legitimacy of the entire process. History's verdict may prove harsher than the courtroom verdicts. A historian writing decades after these events might conclude, the Field Marshals' trials after World War II demonstrated both the promise and the limitations of post-war justice. The promise was that even the most powerful military commanders could be held accountable for crimes committed under their authority, a revolutionary principle in international law. The limitation was that political expediency, Cold War calculations, and simple exhaustion so often undermined that accountability. The result was a patchwork of justice that left many victims feeling betrayed, and many criminals escaping meaningful punishment. The story of what happened to Germany's top field marshals after World War II reminds us that accountability after mass atrocity is always complex, always contested, and never fully satisfying. Perfect justice may be impossible in the aftermath of total war, but the attempt to achieve some measure of accountability matters. The Nuremberg trials and subsequent proceedings established principles that continue to shape international law today. The International Criminal Court, modern tribunals prosecuting war crimes in the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and elsewhere, all of these build on the foundations laid when the Allies decided that Germany's military leaders must answer for their actions. The field marshals are gone now, some dying before trial, some after brief imprisonments, some after living long lives of comfortable retirement. But the questions their cases raise remain vitally important. How do we hold powerful individuals accountable for crimes committed through the machinery of state and military power? What principles should guide post-war justice? How do we balance the competing demands of punishment, deterrence, and reconciliation? These questions matter because conflicts continue, atrocities still occur, and the need for accountability persists. The incomplete reckoning faced by Germany's field marshals stands as both a warning about the difficulties of achieving justice and an affirmation that the attempt must be made. For more stories exploring World War II, the battles that shaped the conflict, the leaders who made critical decisions, the consequences that echo through generations, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. History's lessons remain urgent, and understanding what happened to those who wielded power, who made choices that affected millions, helps us think more clearly about accountability and justice in our own time.